Hello, and welcome to the Oregon Kickoff for the Climate Action Plan with Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici. Thank you for joining us. The discussion will begin in just a few minutes. Last week, Suzanne and her colleagues on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis released their comprehensive roadmap for solving the climate crisis. You can find more information about the Climate Action Plan, the process for developing it, and the Congresswoman's leadership at bonamici.house.gov/climate action plan, all one word. If you have just joined us, welcome to Congresswoman Bonamici's webinar about the Climate Action Plan. Congresswoman Bonamici is joined by Don Sampson from the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, Evelyn Shapiro from the Pacific Northwest Regional Council of Carpenters, and George Waldbusser from Oregon State University. Please join the discussion on social media using Oregon Climate Action, #Oregon Climate Action. Now we'll go ahead and get started. Here's Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici.
Thank you so much, Allie, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Suzanne Bonamici, and I'm honored to serve on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, the only committee member from the Pacific Northwest. And I want to start by thanking my wonderful staff. I can't do this on my own, and I know so many of them worked so hard, particularly Maxine, Allie, and Natalie on this webinar today. Last week, I joined Speaker Pelosi, Select Committee Chair Castor, and my colleagues in releasing a bold, comprehensive, and science-based climate action plan that sets our nation on a path to reach net zero emissions no later than mid-century and net negative thereafter. I first want to acknowledge that this is not an easy time to be discussing forward-looking policy. We're experiencing an unprecedented moment in our nation's history. As coronavirus cases surge in our communities, we're worried about loved ones who are sick or vulnerable. More than 47 million people across the country have filed for unemployment, and there's much uncertainty about whether and when they can go back to work. The support for workers, especially those on the front lines, has failed to adequately meet the needs. The coronavirus pandemic and its economic consequences have a disparate effect on Black and Indigenous people and on communities of color. And now we're having a national conversation about how centuries of systemic racism and policy choices in our country have failed to hold law enforcement accountable for racial profiling and excessive use of force against Black Americans. But even in this moment in history, when our communities are struggling and inequalities seem more apparent than ever, the climate crisis continues. It's not taking a break. In May of 2020, just a few months ago, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations exceeded the highest monthly average ever recorded. Our most vulnerable communities, including low-income communities, Black, Indigenous, communities of color, have been the hardest hit by COVID-19 and are also disproportionately affected by inaction to address the climate crisis. We simply cannot wait any longer. Addressing the climate crisis also presents an economic opportunity. We can create millions of good-paying, high-quality jobs that will help working families and displaced workers recover from the economic collapse caused by COVID-19 and the pandemic. Our climate action plan is centered on the principles of justice and equity because everyone needs and deserves access to clean air, clean water, and a planet free from toxic pollution. Building a resilient clean energy economy using the climate action framework will boost our economic recovery and allow us to begin the repair of the legacy that environmental racism and pollution have burdened on low-income communities and communities of color for decades. I'm very pleased to be joined today by three extraordinary leaders who informed my work on the Climate Action Plan. Don Sampson from the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, Evelyn Shapiro from the Pacific Northwest Regional Council of Carpenters, and Professor Dr. George Waldbusser from Oregon State University. Their expertise and input are weaved throughout the recommendations in the plan, and I'm grateful for their support. A note to our audience, this event is live streamed on my YouTube channel. If you have questions during the event, please use the chat feature. I'd now like to invite our guests to introduce themselves and provide a few remarks. And I'll start with Don Sampson from the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. Welcome, Don.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bonamici, and especially for all you that are joining us on this very important topic today. As you know, the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians is comprised of over 57 tribes from the Pacific Northwest. And myself, as a fisheries scientist, I am the Climate Project Director. And we have been working with tribal governments across the country, not only in the Northwest, but the entire country from Maine to Florida to California to Oregon and Alaska. As the Congressman well knows, that our Indigenous people, frontline people, communities of color face disproportionate impacts from climate. And here in Oregon in particular, we live in rural communities, whether it be in Pendleton, Oregon, or on the coast, the Coquille tribe or the Klamath tribe. And we see the impacts in our communities from climate change. Many people are familiar with the catastrophic wildfires we've seen in California, in Oregon, and in Washington over the past few years. We've seen impacts from ocean acidification that are affecting our salmon populations on the coast of Oregon and in the Columbia Basin, the Columbia River. We've seen some huge impact to our Columbia River salmon runs themselves because of increasing temperatures, increasing water temperatures. We've had extreme die-offs of sockeye salmon in the Columbia, sturgeon on the Columbia. We see rural communities that are affected because of the lack of water supply. We're seeing a decline in snowpack. Places like Glacier National Park, which I was at just not long ago, this last summer. In the next 50 years, many of those glaciers will be gone. Those provide key water supply for communities, both tribal and rural communities. And so as we see the impacts, we know that we have to take action. And one of the cornerstones of the work that was done by our Congresswoman, as well as the Select Committee, is to make sure that environmental justice is a cornerstone of the policy. And so the Affiliated Tribes was happy to join at the call of Congresswoman Bonamici, but also the Select Committee and the Senate Committee on the Climate Crisis, and a call to action and find recommendations. And so we worked with the committees and tribes across the United States to come up with the best ideas and strategies to start working on a resilient future for all Americans. So we thank you so much for the work. You'll find that this climate action plan is back, putting US and America back in the forefront of the work to address climate impacts across the world. I was there in Paris in 2015 with other Indigenous people from around the world, and we were pressing every country to step up and take these types of actions. And so we're proud of the work that they're doing. Our tribal nations, the 574 tribal nations, are so excited that Congress is taking this effort forward, and we stand prepared to help make this a reality so that we do have a beautiful future, a healthy future for our children. So we thank you so much for this time.
Thank you so much, Don. And I'm glad you used the word opportunity. It's an opportunity to make things stronger, healthier, and fairer. Next, we're going to hear from Evelyn Shapiro from the Pacific Northwest Regional Council of Carpenters. Thank you for joining us, Evelyn.
Thank you, Representative Bonamici. I'm Evelyn Shapiro, the Principal Officer of the Northwest Carpenters Union. I'm proud to represent 29,000 hardworking men and women throughout the 6 states in the Pacific Northwest. Our members do work that is already in green energy. They do work really in every aspect of the industry. We're very proud of the skills that our members currently have, and we're always changing and growing. We have a tremendously robust and adaptive training program that's able to react and anticipate technology changes or different industry changes, and we always really look forward to that. We're also particularly excited to welcome more hardworking men and women into our ranks. We have a tremendous amount of opportunities for living wage jobs with strong family benefits. And in many cases, these jobs are available to people who in other aspects of their life would not have the opportunity. It's a hard industry, but it's a rewarding industry, and it's a heck of a lot of fun. I come out of the craft myself, and I really encourage anybody to join up with us, and we will get you to where you need to be a full tradesperson. It's a fantastic opportunity to expand our membership with women. It's a tremendous opportunity to expand people of color. Many of these projects are happening in communities that disproportionately affect communities of color, and we really look forward to having our ranks also better represented by the people who live in the communities in which we build. So we're really grateful to be part of this conversation. And as Representative Bonamici and I have discussed before, we're really enthusiastic about ensuring that we have a world that can be preserved for our children and grandchildren, but also be really thoughtful about how to not displace their parents and grandparents in the process. So of course, changes like this automatically introduce displacement. So we're very excited to see that in this plan, there's a tremendous amount of thought put into the millions of jobs that would be displaced and would really need to be recreated in an exciting new industry. So thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Evelyn. And last but certainly not least, George Waldbusser from Oregon State University. Welcome, George.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman, for inviting me and taking such a strong leadership role on these issues about the ocean. Being a scientist, I am obligated to have a couple of PowerPoint slides. So I think this hopefully is working. You should be able to see those slides. I just want to acknowledge all the great federal support we've had for this work over the years, NOAA, NSF, and then local support from Sea Grant, and some recent support from a foundation called Climate Works, which we're working with to try to figure out action plans and actionable work that we can do to help combat ocean acidification. So I sort of feel like this whole climate thing feels like lions and tigers and bears right now. And this is really kind of a short story of hope and success. But let me start with the lions and tigers and bears. So, we know climate change is causing marine heat waves, or otherwise we've sort of referred to them as warm blobs. This is from some work a couple of years ago. And so this needs to be updated, but there are continuing these sort of excessive anomalies in temperature. And Don mentioned some of those impacts on fisheries. We know harmful algal blooms have expanded along our coast and have impacted things like the Dungeness crab fishery. We know that our actions on land and in estuaries have created tremendous habitat loss. For example, about 85% of the estuarine habitat in the west coast of the US has been lost in the last 100 years or so. And finally, ocean acidification, the topic that's probably closest to what I normally work on, has impacted the shellfish industry. So it sounds really bad, but there's time to act, and the time is now to do so. And so one of the great successes we have has been with the oyster industry, the shellfish hatcheries on the west coast of the US. This is just showing a couple oyster larvae at 4 days of age when they're grown under good water, non-corrosive, non-acidified water, and acidified water. This nearly shut down the entire West Coast industry, and we came up with a solution, which was effectively putting an antacid in the water for the hatcheries. And so that has now been implemented across the West Coast and across the entire country, on the East Coast and in the Gulf states as well. And we've worked with a number of international collaborators as well to help implement these approaches, and it has been successful for at least helping with this industry. And so what really saved the West Coast industry is we have to acknowledge the monitoring work that's been done with Berkelator, and Dr. Burkell is a colleague of mine right here. We've done some really great basic science on oyster larvae, this buffering work, and then engagement with the stakeholders. And so working with the shellfish growers such as Alan Barton and Sue Cutt at the Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery. And the plan that the Congresswoman has helped shepherd through is really touching on all of these aspects, the engagement, the monitoring, and the science to help us figure out solutions forward. Some other tools that we have right now, we've done this work a while back, and we're doing some more of this work now to figure out how to better buffer, essentially put acid actually out in the environment and do that in a way that's responsible. This is just showing some work we did back in Maine many years ago. But when we put a crushed up shell back in the environment, we can nearly triple the amount of clams that show up in those habitats. And so this is one approach where we're actually returning materials back to the environment that we end up taking out. We've done some work looking at seagrasses, and so there's sort of mixed data and there's a lot of work going on. But we know now in Neatards Bay, where the hatchery is, that where seagrasses are, we do grow better oysters. And the faster the seagrasses grow, the better and faster the oysters grow. And then finally, restoring oyster reefs in most of our estuaries. We found this work back in Chesapeake Bay with colleagues there, that these restored oyster reefs in Chesapeake Bay actually have amongst the highest amount of buffering capacity they're releasing back into the environment and helping to combat impacts on pH and acidification from global CO2 emissions as well as other local sources. I wanted to sort of wrap up with work that we're doing. A colleague of mine, David Rathfull and David Kling, are both at OSU, and this was work a grad student of his has done, and you can check out this link here and play around with this. This is basically an interface where we can look at taking all the data in our understanding right now of ocean acidification and sensitivities and look at spatially where we expect the biggest impacts to be, and that those impacts tie directly to the people that rely on these shellfish. And so getting towards the social sensitivity and the jobs that could be impacted by not acting on climate change. So just in summary, we have to act now. It's taken a long time to get us there, but we need to do it now. We can't forget about carbon reduction. That has to be a primary component. Repairing and restoring these coastal ecosystems builds resilience. We often forget here on the West Coast with how pristine our estuaries appear to be to us, that actually we've altered them in tremendous ways, and we need to repair that, restore those habitats. We need to work together on this across stakeholders and all the various interests in those resources, but we also need the resources and financial tools to move that forward. And we do have several tools that we can employ today to start making progress on this. And I've been told this before years ago when I worked on the Blue Ribbon panel in Washington State, but it's ever so present, and the cost of inaction will almost certainly be more expensive than the cost of action to do things today and to help mitigate climate change. And there are still a lot of great people fighting to protect these systems and the people that depend on them. And so these are just a number of students that some of which have come through my lab as grad students, but to me, these are the people we need to be thinking about, the young people today and the environment that we're going to leave them with. And so it's great that this climate action plan has been pulled together, and I hope it's going to help us to get on a better trajectory for the future. So I will stop there.
Well, thank you so much, George. Thank you, Don and Evelyn. As you have each demonstrated from an environmental justice, labor, and ocean health and science perspective, the climate crisis is an existential threat, and it is a national emergency. The science is clear and alarming, but there is hope. By acknowledging the scale of the climate crisis, we can implement bold policies to address it. And thanks to the youth leaders sounding the alarm to take meaningful action, we have the Green New Deal, weekly climate strikes across the world, and a lot of people out there fighting to give us momentum. So last year, Speaker Pelosi established a select committee on the climate crisis, and we were charged with producing a bold, science-based, comprehensive plan to address the climate crisis. We released a formal request for information, and we received more than 700 substantive responses from stakeholders and people across the country, including many in Northwest Oregon. And I'm grateful for their work on this comprehensive plan and glad we had such an enthusiastic response from our region. Our climate action plan sets the nation on a path to reach net zero emissions no later than mid-century and net negative thereafter. I'm going to wait just a moment for the slides to catch up with me. Okay, I don't know what's happening with the slides. Well, I'll keep going and then I'll wait. Hopefully the slides will catch up with me. These are science-based targets, and I really want to emphasize that's true with the entire climate action plan. We base this on science, and importantly, they are achievable. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, net zero emissions refers to balancing human-caused emissions with the deliberate removal of emissions through natural carbon sinks like trees, soil, wetlands, or carbon capture and storage. Net negative emissions means that more greenhouse gases are removed from the atmosphere than are emitted into it. Both are important to consider as we're crafting policies to reduce emissions. The climate crisis affects our entire economy, and it will take our entire economy to address it. Our climate action plan is divided into 12 pillars, and each pillar contains building blocks of recommendations. Environmental justice and the needs of workers are incorporated into each pillar. Together, these pillars constitute a meaningful set of policies to accelerate our transition to a 100% clean energy economy, to focus on the needs of frontline communities, and to create good-paying jobs. We previewed a draft of our recommendations with the nonpartisan think tank Energy Innovation. They used their open source energy policy simulator to model the emissions reductions and benefits from implementing a subset of the Select Committee's recommendations. They found that implementing our climate action plan would reduce overall US greenhouse gas emissions by 37% below 2010 levels in 2030 and 88% below 2010 levels by 2050. And importantly, provide nearly $8 trillion in cumulative climate and health benefits through 2050 and avoid 62,000 premature deaths annually by 2050. Here we go with the slides. I just want to repeat that last part. Avoid 62,000 premature deaths annually by 2050. So today I'm going to provide an overview of a few of the sections of the Climate Action Plan related to labor, clean energy, the ocean, environmental justice, and resilience and climate science. So as a leader on the Education and Labor Committee and the granddaughter of a coal miner, I know the way we transition to a clean energy economy is as important as the transition itself. Workers are on the front line and will be on the front line of the transformation in our economy. And this is even more important to recognize today as more than 48 million people have filed for unemployment benefits and are looking for a path to economic recovery. Our transition to a clean energy economy must be an opportunity, and we must look at it as an opportunity to support good paying, high quality union jobs. Our climate action plan recognizes that we need to restore fairness to our economy. That makes it easier for workers to form unions and collectively bargain. The House passed the Protecting the Right to Organize Act last year. The Senate needs to bring it up for a vote. Now, after working with unions and workers across the country, we recognize the need to address past failures and make sure that federal clean energy investments uphold labor standards. Our climate action plan integrates Buy American requirements. So important to put that focus on buying American. Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements and the use of community benefit agreements and project labor agreements. And as extreme heat and weather events become more common, we need to make sure that all workers are safe on the job, especially farm workers who are supplying our food chain and are disproportionately at risk. Our climate action plan recognizes the need to invest in registered apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeship programs to help people access and get the skills they need to get those clean energy and infrastructure jobs. And those jobs should be available to people who have historically faced barriers to unemployment. Evelyn was talking about this, like women, people of color. Despite these investments, we also need to recognize that some workers will be displaced or dislocated from their current job, especially those in the fossil fuel sector. And we recommend creating a National Economic Transition Office. And this office will be providing these workers with targeted support services and resources. I'm working to turn this particular recommendation into a bill right now. And as a leader on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, I've been working across the aisle for the last 8 years to advance legislation to help accelerate our transition to a 100% clean energy economy. Our climate action plan would help boost the deployment of clean energy in the short term by extending and expanding tax incentives for clean energy, including the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. But full decarbonization of the economy will require transformational technologies that have yet to be deployed and commercialized. Our plan recommits and builds on the Mission Innovation Commitments, which is a global initiative to accelerate clean energy innovation started in the Obama administration, and it substantially increases investment in clean energy research, development, demonstration, and deployment over the next 10 years. So much potential. It would rapidly increase funding for the Department of Energy's ARPA-E program, which supports high-risk, high-reward innovation. And I'm pleased that our climate action plan includes my Regional Clean Energy Innovation Act to support clean energy innovation in the mid and post-research stage and help projects overcome obstacles to deployment and commercialization. And as the co-chair of the House Oceans Caucus and the Congressional Estuary Caucus, I'm thrilled that our plan for solving the climate crisis recognizes the power of our ocean as part of the solution. Our climate action plan sets the ambitious goal of protecting at least 30% of our lands and ocean no later than 2030. These protections will help enhance the ecological benefits, biodiversity, and carbon sequestration value of natural ecosystems and our most treasured wild places. We improve adaptation and mitigation efforts to conserve fisheries and endangered species in the Northwest and strengthen our natural infrastructure to protect our estuaries and wetlands. Coastal plant habitats, including kelp forests, mangroves, tidal marshes, seagrasses, and wetlands, have the ability to sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in stems, branches, leaves, roots, and soils for centuries, maybe millennia. And my bipartisan Blue Carbon for Our Planet Act is a cornerstone of our ocean recommendations and will help strengthen blue carbon research and support the conservation and restoration of blue carbon ecosystems so we can maximize this effective carbon sequestration tool in our fight against the climate crisis. And George, in his presentation, talked about the need for that work. Unfortunately, as we learned from the IPCC's special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate just last year, some of the effects of the climate crisis are already locked in. From the blob off the Oregon coast, that was in 2014, to seasonal issues with hypoxia and ocean acidification, we are seeing effects in our coastal communities. The House has passed my bipartisan Coast Research Act and 3 other bipartisan bills last year to strengthen scientific research and monitoring efforts across federal agencies on ocean and coastal acidification in the context of other environmental stressors, and also direct federal agencies to assess adaptation and mitigation strategies, and those policies are reflected in our climate action plan. We must also recognize that our ocean can play a part in the transition to a 100% clean energy economy. Our climate action plan safeguards our ocean and coasts by prohibiting offshore oil and gas drilling. We can instead focus on the untapped potential of marine energy. Researchers at Oregon State University are leading the way on this innovative work. Waves, tides, and currents carry kinetic energy that can be captured and converted into electricity to power homes, buildings, and cities. Our climate action plan also takes steps to begin to repair the legacy of environmental racism and pollution that has burdened disproportionately low income and communities of color for decades. A study from Portland State University last year demonstrated how historically racist redlining housing policies in Northeast Portland, for example, have exacerbated the effects of warming temperatures and poor air quality for Black people and people of color. Climate change disproportionately threatens the livelihoods and economies of Indigenous communities, including their cultural relationships with ancestral lands through agriculture, hunting, fishing, forestry, energy, recreation, and tourism. In July of 2019, a group of environmental justice leaders and national environmental organizations released the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, which informed our climate action plan. My colleagues, Representative Raul Grijalva and Don McEachin, also held a congressional convening on environmental justice to inform their work on the Comprehensive Environmental Justice for All Act, which is the foundation of our recommendations for a just transition. Our climate action plan calls for enforcing the bedrock environmental laws that unfortunately the Trump administration has attempted to roll back, like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. We double the EPA's enforcement budget and provide direction for the EPA Inspector General to review the outcomes for environmental justice communities. Our plan will help protect victims of environmental and climate injustice by amending the Civil Rights Act to define discrimination based on disparate impact. And importantly, at a time when the president is trying to limit public participation, our plan will strengthen public consultation for environmental justice communities under the National Environmental Policy Act. Through my conversations with Don and the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians and the National Congress of American Indians, we learned that tribes are not currently eligible for many federal clean energy and resilience programs. Our climate action plan seeks to remedy the exclusionary provisions in federal funding and better acknowledge traditional lands and waters that tribes access under their treaty rights and the federal government's historical injustices and failure to recognize those rights and honor them. Importantly, our plan for solving the climate crisis focuses on the root of the problem, efforts to reduce emissions. But we also recognize that the effects of the climate crisis are already here and exacerbating social, racial, and economic inequalities. We do not ignore the need for immediate adaptation and resilience policies. Our climate action plan calls for a climate risk information service to develop and localize climate risk information, which will include projections of floods, wildfires, and other natural disasters. This approach will better inform the development of resilience codes, specifications, and standards for our local communities. We established a National Climate Adaptation Commission to better coordinate adaptation planning across federal agencies and distribute funding and technical assistance to states, local governments, tribes, and territories. Notably, our plan also calls for more investment in scientific research and monitoring. We have better maps of the moon than we do of the ocean floor. And the ocean data that we do have is not always easily accessible. Coastal communities, including fisheries, rely on accurate and ocean data and monitoring for information about ocean acidification, forecasting of harmful algal blooms and hypoxia, tsunami preparedness, navigation, and port security. Like my bipartisan Blue Globe Act, our plan will create an Advanced Research Project Agency, OCEAN, or ARPA-O, to overcome the long-term and high-risk barriers in the development of ocean technologies. Efforts to address the climate crisis must be based on the best available peer-reviewed science, and at a time when the administration continues to dismiss and disrespect scientists, our climate action plan safeguards climate science from political interference. Our climate action plan is comprehensive. For example, we recognize that the electricity sector is the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and rapid decarbonization is necessary to meet our target of net zero no later than mid-century. Our climate action plan achieves net zero emissions in the electricity sector by 2040 by establishing a technology neutral clean energy standard that credits zero emission technologies like wind, solar, energy storage, nuclear, hydropower, and carbon capture. The transportation sector is the largest source of energy-related carbon dioxide emissions in the country, and it's a significant source of air pollution for environmental justice communities. Our climate action plan expedites deployment of zero emission vehicles, 100% sale of zero emission cars by 2035, and medium and heavy duty trucks by 2040. State and local governments largely have authority over the building sector, but the federal government can provide financial incentives and technical support to accelerate decarbonization. Our climate action plan calls for eliminating emissions from new buildings by 2030, creating good paying jobs in the trades and energy efficiency sectors. Our plan imposes a moratorium on fossil fuel leasing on public lands, prohibits new offshore oil and gas leasing, and ends, finally, subsidies for oil and gas production on public lands. And to recognize that farmers and ranchers are some of the best stewards of our lands, we invest in new and existing conservation programs to provide financial and technical assistance to farmers and ranchers, eager to deploy sustainable practices like no and low-till farming, planting cover crops, and rotational grazing. These are only a few examples of the more than 500 pages, not 5,000, 500 pages in our plan. And now we're going to turn those recommendations into law. Last week, the House passed H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act. There I am speaking about it. I'm grateful to Chairman Peter DeFazio for working with a select committee to integrate many of our recommendations. This bill increases investments in transit and zero emission buses, supports the development of more electric vehicle charging infrastructure, creates a carbon pollution reduction apportionment program, and a pre-disaster mitigation program to support natural infrastructure and other measures that help communities prepare for and mitigate the effects of climate change. The Moving Forward Act is the most climate-centric transportation package to pass the House. Our climate action plan is clear, comprehensive, and science-based. It's a roadmap for Congress, and in the coming months, I will continue to work with my colleagues to advance the legislation and recommendations. I also look forward to discussing the climate action plan with the Oregonians and hearing your feedback. I'll be convening roundtable discussions with stakeholders and planning a climate action tour to the people and places in Northwest Oregon who are leading the way to protecting our planet. I hope I can do that soon. And people who are supporting a just transition and creating those good paying, high quality jobs. I encourage you to follow along on social media and visit my website at bonamici.house.gov/climate action plan, all one word, for more information. So we are now going to open the discussion for questions from our audience. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions. Allie is going to be reading the questions, or if you would like to ask your question, Natalie will be unmuting you throughout. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, as the Congresswoman was just saying, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window to ask a question. We also have some pre-submitted questions that we'd like to share. And so I'll be starting with one from Nancy in Beaverton. Nancy asks, how are we to address the larger issue of climate change when the current administration has recently rolled back the EPA protections we had in place?
Oh, thank you for that question, Nancy. And again, this is a climate action plan that is based on science, and we understand the need to protect our clean air, our clean water. You know, those environmental bills have traditionally been bipartisan over the years. They were signed into law during a Republican administration. They shouldn't be partisan. And please know that the Select Committee and I will continue to fight for those policies and those important laws that protect clean air and clean water, and make sure that we are, again, basing our recommendations and our work on science. Thanks, Nancy.
Great. For our next question, we'll go to a live question that was submitted by Mark Healy. Mark asked a question about blue carbon and what restoration projects might look like here in Oregon. So Mark, you should be live and on the line.
Hi, Mark. Did you want to ask that, or did you?
No, I'm good with answering.
Okay, terrific. Yeah, we are looking at in the Blue Carbon for Our Planet Act, which is bipartisan, looking at all the restoration, coastal and estuary restoration. And as I mentioned, there are so many ways that our natural habitats can help when we help preserve the habitats themselves and when they act as a carbon sink. It's a win-win. And I see George is nodding his head and might want to weigh in on this one as well.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there are so many opportunities to do this because of the loss of estuarine habitat, where we have these tremendous carbon sinks in salt marshes and in some cases seagrasses, and I saw you noted kelp as well, and as well as forests. So it's just a matter of us having the political will and the infrastructure in place to be able to implement these restoration projects and let those systems do what they would do naturally anyway. And so that's an important part of this whole carbon plan in a sense.
And part of the natural solutions. Thank you so much, Mark, for your question.
Great. Well, just a reminder that if you'd like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Our next live question will be from Amy Johnson. Amy asked a question about why the targets were set for this plan. Amy, you're live.
Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for your question. Thanks for joining us. Our targets were set based on science and based on the conversations that we had among ourselves and among scientific experts, and put together with the policies that we have in mind. We wish we could do it more rapidly, but we looked at the science and we looked at what we could achieve, and are being bold and optimistic, and we'll work really hard to do what we can. So thank you for asking that question, again, based on science and input from the experts. Thank you.
Great. Our next question was submitted by Chandra in the questions. Chandra has a question about public lands and how we can do better than net zero emissions. So let me give Natalie just a moment to find Chandra here, and then we can have them ask their question.
Hi, Chandra.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, yeah, I was, intrigued to see the net zero emissions goal for public lands, and I understand that at least what you talked about on reducing the impacts of oil and gas drilling and exploration. But that ignores the fact that our forests, especially here in Oregon, can be a huge carbon sink and help us get to help us address the problem of emissions, not only by soaking up more carbon out of the air, but by storing it, over a very long period of time. And then we get co-benefits like preserving healthy ecosystems, cleaning our water, and providing wildlife habitat. So I'm curious how the plan addresses the issue of public forest lands.
Absolutely. And we had those conversations, and it's so important to have the goal of preserving, but also, when we're facing wildfires, we need to have good sound forest management and mitigation strategies for wildfires. And we absolutely recognize the power of the forest and that natural solutions section to help, as you said, act as a carbon sink. So responsible forest management, making sure that we're planning to address wildfires, and really reaching that goal of preserving our public lands. Thank you.
Great. Well, our next question was pre-submitted. This question comes from Maggie in Beaverton. And Maggie's question is, how does this plan compare with the energy and carbon reduction goals outlined in the Green New Deal? Why is the Green New Deal not being publicly supported or endorsed by the committee?
Thank you. And who was it, Maggie, who asked? Oh, thank you so much, Maggie. I signed on to the Green New Deal because I like the bold policies in it, but it's not as specific as the climate action plan. Our specific recommendations in the 12 different pillars. So it really gets into a lot more detail in each area, each of the pillars. So I can tell you what those are. Infrastructure, first one, energy and transforming into and domestic manufacturing of zero emission technologies, then breaking down barriers to green energy technologies, importantly, investing in America's workforce. 6 is environmental justice. Pillar 7 is public health and mental health. 8 is investing in climate solutions in agriculture.
Congresswoman, you're freezing a little bit.
9 is making communities more water. Oh, sorry. Land,
okay.
water, ocean. And 11 is national security and international and restoring our place on the international stage. And then finally, 12 is restoring and preserving our core institutions to facilitate climate action and strengthening climate science. So you can see it's very comprehensive, and in each of those pillars are many specific recommendations. So the Green New Deal is certainly an important statement of what we need to do, but this really puts the details in policy recommendations. So thank you so much, Maggie.
Great. Next, we'll take a live question from Scott Laird. Scott has a question about bipartisanship. I'll give Natalie just a moment to get, oh, I see him there. Okay.
Hi, Scott. Welcome. I think you're still muted, Scott.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sure.
Welcome.
So, yeah, thank you. Thanks for taking my question.
Of course.
As we here in Oregon have seen in the past at the state level, passing climate change legislation can be very difficult. And so I'm just wondering what kind of plan or ideas you have about trying to generate bipartisan support for this federal climate change plan.
Yeah, very much appreciate that question. And I've served on the Science Committee my entire time in Congress and have spent about 4 times as much time in the minority party as in the majority party, and have always worked to have bipartisan support on recommendations and on policies. And many of the components of the climate action plan, it's not one piece of legislation, it is many pieces of legislation and recommendations. Many of those are bipartisan. And for example, my blue carbon for our planet, bipartisan. Some of the workforce provisions, opening up opportunities to get job skills, bipartisan. A lot of the recommendations are bipartisan. We will continue to get bipartisan support and to work with our colleagues, and certainly our colleagues on both sides of the aisle understand that as people transition from fossil fuel economies, we know coal is on its way out, and they understand that we have to have opportunities for people to transition to good jobs, local jobs, and get the skills to get them. So those are just some of the examples of where things are bipartisan. Unfortunately, we're in a challenging time with a lot of divisiveness, but I will continue my work to reach out and have bipartisan support. And I know many of my colleagues will as well. I know the chair of the committee, Representative Kathy Castor, is working with the Republicans on the committee to figure out what we can actually move forward right away that is bipartisan. So I appreciate that. And we have a diverse country, and we need to make sure that what we're doing works everywhere. So thanks for your question, Scott.
Thank you.
One thing I want to mention as well, which I neglected to mention, the ocean acidification and algal blooms work that I've been doing, that's been bipartisan along the way too. There's a lot that is bipartisan that's already incorporated in.
Great. Next. Great. We'll take a live question next. This is from Kathy Moyd. Kathy submitted a question about carbon pricing. And so we'll just take a minute here and see if we can get Kathy to ask that question live on the line. Thanks so much, Kathy, for joining us today.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi, I was just wondering about the putting a price on carbon. I noticed that it was in your plan. I've been actively supporting Citizens Climate Lobby and we do have the bill that's actually in Congress now that I think actually does satisfy the criteria that are specified in your plan. So I wonder if you discuss that a little bit.
Sure. Well, the report does have a recommendation of putting a price on carbon, but there are many different ideas about how to do that. So that is something that we will continue to work on. And I know that thank you for your advocacy with the Citizens Climate Lobby. I know you have a whole national movement. This particular report did not pick one certain method or format, but we do recommend putting a price on carbon. So that is, we know that's something that needs to get done. And that is why we recommended it. But again, there's so many policies. We want to pick one that we know can move forward. So thank you so much. Thank you for your advocacy. I've always enjoyed meeting with the Citizens Climate Lobby.
Great. Well, we did have one question queued up for Dawn, but I'll give a minute and we'll switch to another question here. So we have a pre-submitted question from Angela in Portland. Angela would like to know how the Climate Action Plan promotes solar.
Yes, so thank you, Angela. Absolutely, we are promoting technologies that are zero emission, and there's a lot in there from the production tax credit to all of the different ways where in each of the pillars solar can play a role. We promote clean energy that's zero emission energy, and certainly solar has a big part in that. So thank you for your question. We know how important that is here in Oregon and across the country. A lot of good jobs too, solar industries. Did we get Don back for a question?
We're working on it, but in the meantime, I can ask another pre-submitted question that I've also seen come up in the Q&A as well. This comes from Brittany in Portland. How has Representative Bonamici incorporated equity throughout her climate plan?
Yeah, thank you, Brittany. Equity and environmental justice have been part of this climate action plan. Really from the outset, there's an entire plank or pillar on environmental justice, but it is woven in because we do know that there's been a disproportionate impact. It's true with COVID, and it's true with environmental justice. We do know that environmental justice is part of this. The climate crisis has disproportionately affected people of color, people in low-income areas, Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. And environmental justice needs to be part of the solution. It is, again, woven throughout. I mentioned in some of my remarks, we got input, from people across the country, from tribes. I mentioned we opened up funding to tribes, some of that funding that has previously been unavailable, and just making sure that we are making a priority the communities that have been disproportionately affected and putting those at the forefront, not as an afterthought. It's woven throughout the entire plan, but there is, again, that whole pillar of environmental justice.
Great. And then this will be our last question, unfortunately.
Goodness, time goes by so quickly.
It does. So this question is from Jeff in Wilsonville. Jeff asks,
Hi, Jeff.
I know the pandemic was incorporated into the report as it's likely to continue for a while and have deep and extended effects. Do you see potential changes to the recommendations if the duration or effects are worse than expected?
Well, thank you for that question, Jeff. And there is so much uncertainty around coronavirus and how long it's going to go on and whether we'll develop a vaccine and what we're going to do about it. We actually took some time. This was originally going to be released in March, and we took some time to look at the health aspects, to look at the jobs portions and make some adaptations based on that, really understanding that there are going to be a lot of people looking for work, but also we had some really good presentations about the health impacts. People who live in more polluted areas, for example, disproportionately affected by COVID. So the health impacts were considered. We did make some adjustments, and I think it only amplifies the need for the climate action plan to be seen as an opportunity to get people back to work and good jobs when we're also addressing so many injustices, to look at this as a way to make our communities and our economy stronger, healthier, and fairer. So will there be additional changes based on coronavirus? I can't say exactly, but I do know that if the coronavirus pandemic continues, there will be even more need for the good jobs and for addressing the economic justice issues. So we're out of time, I think, for questions, unfortunately. Well, thank you so much. I do invite everyone to really dive into the report. It's available online. Thank you so much to Don and to George and to Evelyn for joining us today, but really to all of you. I hope the conversation helped to demonstrate the urgent need to act on climate. And also I hope it demonstrated how our climate action plan can serve as a roadmap to set our nation on the path to a net zero emission economy no later than mid-century and net negative thereafter. It is a challenging time for communities in Northwest Oregon and across the country, but together we can protect our planet. We can create good paying jobs, support a just transition, and build more resilient communities. I have children, my children are grown. I don't have any grandchildren yet, but when I think about the kind of world that I want to leave for the next generation and the generation after, that's what this climate action plan does. It puts us on that path. And I encourage you to stay in touch with me and my office through my staff, or by calling my office. Even though my staff is working remotely, you can call 503-469-6010 and leave a message. I think they're working around the clock sometimes because they're doing so much. Someone will get back to you. So please stay safe, stay healthy, and really look forward to you spending time reading the report, looking at the recommendations, and then giving feedback to us. And thank you again for joining us. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay engaged. Thanks, everybody.